Welcome to the Voices of Life podcast, a ministry of the Church for Life. I'm Pastor David. Today we're doing something very special. For this episode, Voices of Life has teamed up with Co-Pilot Podcasts to bring you a powerful, did you know, historical feature, exploring the origins of the United States Coast Guard and its remarkable journey from 1790 to today. This collaboration allows us to blend faith, history, and storytelling with the clarity and precision of two outstanding narrators. After my introduction, you'll hear from Michael Carter, who will guide you through the early American story, the financial challenges after the Revolution, Alexander Hamilton's vision, and the creation of the Revenue Marine. Then Emily Brooks will carry the narrative forward, walking us through the Coast Guard's evolution, its wartime service, and its modern-day missions that continue to protect life, property, and the freedom on the seas. So settle in, open your heart, and let's step together into a moment of American history that still shapes our nation today. This is Voices of Life, and this is your Did You Know feature on the founding of the United States Coast Guard.
10 small wooden boats built to collect taxes. That's it. That was the entire founding vision of what would become one of America's 5 armed services. No grand naval ambitions, no rescue missions, just Alexander Hamilton trying to stop smugglers from dodging tariffs. Today, we're tracing the full arc of the U.S. Coast Guard, from that scrappy 1790 Revenue Marine all the way to a modern force juggling 11 separate statutory missions, and we'll get into why, right now, it's facing what officials are calling its worst readiness crisis since World War II. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how this institution kept reinventing itself over 235 years, what that evolution actually cost, and what's at stake if it can't pull off its next transformation. I've got someone here who has really dug into this history, so let's get into it. Walk me through where this whole thing actually starts.
So it starts on August 4th, 1790. President George Washington signs the Tariff Act, and Congress authorizes the construction of 10 vessels to enforce tariff and trade laws and to prevent smuggling. That's the official birth date, according to the Coast Guard's own historian's office.
And the person behind all of this is Alexander Hamilton.
Completely. As the first Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton believed the country needed a maritime law enforcement fleet to collect tariffs and intercept smugglers. And here's the thing. According to Britannica, he was not trying to build a navy, he was trying to collect taxes. The new government desperately needed revenue to function, and tariff dodgers were just choosing unstaffed ports to avoid paying.
So it's basically a tax enforcement problem that gets solved with boats.
Exactly. And Hamilton's solution was a fleet of cutters, small, fast, maneuverable boats that could patrol the coastline and intercept ships trying to skirt the law. But what's fascinating is how hands-on he was about it. According to Britannica, his handprints were all over the project from conception to launch. Each cutter had to be built domestically, each was equipped with specific weapons and equipment, down to the same number of inches of cloth for its sails.
Wait, he specified the sailcloth? Like, down to the inches?
Down to the inches. The man was meticulous. And he also built in a financial incentive for the crews. They received a share of the proceeds from confiscated cargo. So you had these sailors who were literally motivated to chase smugglers because they got a cut of whatever they seized.
That's a pretty clever incentive structure, honestly.
It really is. And here's the part that I think gets completely overlooked. The Navy had been disbanded after the American Revolution. So from 1790 until 1798, when the Navy was re-established, this little fleet of 10 revenue cutters was the only armed maritime force in the entire country. The Coast Guard's own historian's office makes this point explicitly.
So Hamilton accidentally built America's de facto navy.
Quietly, yes, without calling it that. And the crews figured out pretty fast that their job was bigger than just chasing tariff dodgers. According to Britannica, once the boats were in service by 1791, the cutter service became indispensable for patrolling local waterways, defending against pirates, rescuing people in distress, and enforcing federal laws. Many of those missions are still part of what the Coast Guard does today.
So the mission creep started almost immediately.
Almost from day one. And that pattern of the Coast Guard absorbing new responsibilities as the nation's needs changed, that's really the defining thread of its entire history.
Okay, I have to bring this up because it's too good to skip. Hamilton's first domestic tax was on whiskey, and apparently his critics joked it was because he couldn't hold his liquor. The man is out here building the foundation of American maritime law enforcement, and people are roasting him about his drinking tolerance.
Britannica actually includes that as a fun fact in their piece on the Coast Guard's founding, which tells you something about how history remembers Hamilton, simultaneously one of the most consequential founders and the guy who couldn't escape the whiskey jokes.
Okay, so the service starts as the Revenue Marine, then it becomes the Revenue Cutter Service. When does it actually become the Coast Guard we recognize today?
1915. That's the official founding date of the modern Coast Guard. An act of Congress merged the Revenue Cutter Service with the Life-Saving Service, and the service got its present name. According to the Coast Guard Historian's Office, the nation then had a single maritime service dedicated to saving life at sea and enforcing maritime laws.
And the Life-Saving Service, that's where the rescue mission really comes in.
Right. Britannica notes the Life-Saving Service was formed in 1878, and when it merged with the Revenue Cutter Service, you get this combination of law enforcement and humanitarian rescue under one roof. That's a pretty significant identity shift.
And there's actually a motto that comes out of that life-saving service era that I find kind of haunting.
Yeah, the Coast Guard's unofficial motto is, "You have to go out, but you don't have to come back." And according to Britannica, that phrase has its origins specifically with the US Life-Saving Service, which mandated that crews make every possible effort to carry out a rescue at sea, regardless of conditions. It's not a slogan someone invented for a poster. It was an operational mandate.
That hits differently when you know the context.
It really does. And it tells you something about the culture that got baked into the institution from that merger forward.
So after 1915, the Coast Guard keeps growing. What are the big moments where it absorbs new responsibilities?
There are several, and they happen in waves. In 1939, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered the transfer of the Lighthouse Service to the Coast Guard, so now they're maintaining the nation's aids to maritime navigation, including operating lighthouses. That's a huge operational expansion.
So they go from chasing smugglers to literally keeping the lights on for ships.
Exactly. Then in 1946, Congress permanently transferred the Bureau of Marine Inspection and Navigation to the Coast Guard, which put merchant marine licensing and merchant vessel safety under their authority. And in 1967, they took over the administration of bridges over navigable waterways. All of this is documented in the Coast Guard Historian's Office overview.
Bridges. They're now doing bridges.
Bridges over navigable waterways, yes. And that same year, 1967, the Coast Guard was transferred from the Treasury Department, where it had been since Hamilton founded it, to the Department of Transportation. Then, in 2003, it moved again, this time to the newly created Department of Homeland Security. According to Britannica, that's where it sits today during peacetime.
And in wartime, it goes under the Navy.
In wartime, or at the direction of the President, it operates under the Navy Department. That's from the Coast Guard Historian's Office. And that dual identity, military branch in peacetime under a civilian department, naval force in wartime, is genuinely unique. No other branch of the US Armed Forces works that way.
It's like it exists in two different institutional realities at once.
That's a good way to put it. And that complexity is part of why it's so hard to categorize. Wikipedia describes it as simultaneously a military force and a federal law enforcement agency. The RAND Corporation, which does research for the Coast Guard, describes it as a law enforcement agency, a member of the intelligence community, and a branch of the US Armed Forces, all at once.
Okay, so let's talk about what the Coast Guard actually does today, because I think most people have a pretty vague sense of it. Like, they rescue people and stop drug boats, right?
That's part of it, but the full picture is much bigger. According to the Coast Guard Historian's Office, the service today has 11 statutory missions codified in the Homeland Security Act of 2002. They're split into Homeland Security missions and non-Homeland Security missions.
11. That's a lot.
It is. The Homeland Security side includes ports, waterways and coastal security, drug interdiction, migrant interdiction, defense readiness, and other law enforcement. The non-Homeland Security side includes marine safety, search and rescue, aids to navigation, living marine resources, marine environmental protection, and ice operations, including the International Ice Patrol.
Ice operations. So they're also doing Arctic work.
Polar, ice, and Alaska operations. That's one of the 11 missions. And RAND has specifically flagged the Arctic and the Indo-Pacific as challenging environments where the Coast Guard needs to assess its capabilities. Kulsabilis, the world is changing and the Coast Guard's operational footprint is changing with it.
Let's get into the numbers a bit because I think the scale of this operation surprises people.
So according to Wikipedia, the Coast Guard has over 40,000 active duty personnel, 7,724 reserve personnel, and around 21,000 auxiliarists. And a GAO report from 2023 puts the total personnel figure at more than 55,000 when you include all components. That's a significant military force.
And the budget for all of this?
The GAO reported in 2023 that just the 3 maritime law enforcement missions, drug interdiction, migrant interdiction, and other law enforcement, averaged more than $1.5 billion annually in operating expenses from fiscal years 2011 through 2020. And those 3 missions alone accounted for almost 1/4 of the Coast Guard's total estimated operating expenses over that period.
So 1/4 of the budget just for those 3 missions.
Just for those 3. And that's before you factor in search and rescue, lighthouse maintenance, ice operations, environmental protection, all of it. The financial demands of running 11 missions simultaneously are enormous.
Which brings us to the current situation, because the picture right now is not great.
It's actually pretty alarming, depending on how you read the official documents. The Force Design 2028 Executive Report, which is a formal planning document from the Coast Guard itself, states that the service is facing a readiness crisis and is less ready than at any other time since the end of World War II.
Less ready than at any point since World War II. That's a striking thing for an institution to say about itself.
It is. The report describes the service as fragile, in crisis, and on a path to failure. It cites a significant enlisted workforce shortage, aging assets, cutters, boats, aircraft, IT systems, shore stations that are on the verge of collapse due to long-term lack of maintenance, and modernization efforts that are underfunded and behind schedule.
And the GAO has been flagging this too, right? It's not just internal self-criticism.
Correct. A GAO report from June 2026, so very recent, reviewed 4 Coast Guard reform efforts since 2019 and found gaps in key areas. The GAO found that the Coast Guard did not fully assess its workforce needs in prior reform efforts, and for 2 of those efforts, the service did not fully establish goals and outcomes, making it difficult to determine if the reforms had the intended effects.
So they're trying to reform, but the reforms themselves aren't being measured properly.
That's essentially what the GAO is saying. The June 2026 report specifically notes that certain goals in the current Force Design 2028 plan are not well defined, and there's no performance plan or mechanism to assess whether the reforms are actually working. The GAO's concern is that billions of taxpayer dollars are going into this transformation without a clear way to know if it's succeeding.
What is Force Design 2028 actually trying to do?
It's a major overhaul plan focused on 4 campaigns: people, organization, contracting and acquisitions, and technology. On the people side, the plan calls for growing the military workforce by at least 15,000 members by the end of fiscal year 2028. The official Coast Guard website describes the service as not right-sized for its missions.
15,000 new people. That's a massive expansion.
It is. And on the organizational side, the plan includes creating a Secretary of the Coast Guard, which would be a new position, establishing a deployable specialized forces command, strengthening Coast Guard Cyber Command, and streamlining decision-making at headquarters. The goal, according to the official force design documents, is to become a more agile, capable, and responsive fighting force.
It's interesting because the RAND Corporation is also involved in thinking about the Coast Guard's future, right?
Yeah, RAND has been doing research for the Coast Guard for years. They describe the challenge this way: throughout its history, the Coast Guard has adapted to meet the evolving needs of the nation, and their current work includes something called Paratus Futurum, Latin for ready for the future, which is actually a strategic game they developed for Coast Guard personnel to think through long-term changes in the operating environment.
A game. They built a game to help the Coast Guard plan for the future.
RAND describes it as the first ever game designed specifically for the service. The idea is to help Coast Guard personnel weigh the long view of changes in the operating environment alongside existing near-term demands, which is actually a pretty smart way to do strategic planning. Get people thinking in scenarios rather than just reacting to the current crisis.
So you've got this institution that started as 10 tax boats and is now running 11 statutory missions, facing a readiness crisis and playing strategic board games to figure out its future. That's quite a journey.
And the through line is that every time the nation's needs changed, the Coast Guard absorbed the new responsibility. lighthouses, bridge administration, merchant marine licensing, environmental protection, drug interdiction, Arctic operations. None of that was in Hamilton's original mandate. It all got added layer by layer.
And the argument would be that the resources never quite kept pace with the responsibilities.
That's exactly what the Force Design 2028 executive report argues. It uses the phrase decades of underinvestment, neglect, and strategic drift. And the GAO's findings back that up. The pattern of reform efforts that don't fully measure their own outcomes suggests an institution that's been stretched thin for a long time.
There's something almost ironic about that, right? The Coast Guard's whole identity is adaptability. It keeps taking on new missions, but that same adaptability may have made it easier for policymakers to keep adding responsibilities without adding proportional support.
That's a really sharp observation. And it connects to something the Rand Corporation highlights. The Coast Guard has to contend with a wide variety of threats and challenges simultaneously. It's a law enforcement agency, an intelligence community member, and a military branch all at once. That's an extraordinary ask of any institution.
And it's the only one of the 5 armed services that operates under a civilian department in peacetime.
Right. The Coast Guard's organization parallels that of the US Navy. Ranks, ratings, uniforms are all similar, according to Britannica, but it sits under the Department of Homeland Security, not the Department of Defense. That structural position affects everything from budget negotiations to public visibility.
Which might explain why it's the least talked about of the 5 armed services, despite having this extraordinary history.
Almost certainly. It doesn't have the cultural footprint of the Army or the Navy, but it's been in every major American conflict. The Quasi War, the War of 1812, the Civil War, both World Wars, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. Wikipedia lists all of them. The Coast Guard has been there.
And yet most people couldn't name a single Coast Guard engagement off the top of their head.
That's the visibility problem. And it matters right now because the readiness crisis the service is describing requires public and congressional attention. The GAO's June 2026 report is essentially saying this transformation is using billions of taxpayer dollars and the public deserves to know whether it's working.
So when you step back from all of this, the 235-year arc, the 11 missions, the current crisis, what does it actually come down to?
Here's what I keep coming back to. The Coast Guard's entire history is a story of an institution that was designed to do one thing, collect taxes, and kept being asked to do more. Every decade, a new responsibility. And for most of that history, it found a way to adapt. The question right now is whether the pattern of adaptation can continue when the gap between mission and resources has grown this wide.
And the Force Design 2028 plan is the current answer to that question.
It's the attempt at an answer. The GAO is right to flag that the goals need to be better defined and the outcomes need to be measurable. Because if you're going to grow the workforce by 15,000 people and spend billions on modernization, you need to be able to show it's working. That accountability piece is what's currently missing, according to the GAO's June 2026 findings.
And the stakes are real. This isn't an abstract institutional problem. The Coast Guard is the frontline agency for drug interdiction, migrant interdiction, search and rescue, environmental protection. If it's not functioning at full capacity, those missions suffer.
Exactly. The Coast Guard Historian's Office puts it plainly. The service saves lives, protects the environment, defends the homeland, and enforces federal laws on the high seas, coastal waters, and inland waterways. That's not a narrow mandate. That's a massive operational footprint that touches almost every American who lives near water, which is a lot of Americans.
So here's what this really comes down to for anyone listening. The U.S. Coast Guard started as Alexander Hamilton's solution to a tax collection problem in 1790, 10 boats, 1 job. Over 235 years, it absorbed the life-saving service, the lighthouse service, merchant marine oversight, bridge administration, and eventually 11 statutory missions ranging from Arctic ice operations to cyber command. It's simultaneously a military branch, a law enforcement agency, and a humanitarian rescue service. And it's the only armed service that flips between a civilian department and the Navy, depending on whether the country is at war. And the thing that makes this moment particularly significant is that the institution is being honest about its own fragility in a way that's unusual. The Force Design 2028 executive report doesn't soften it. It says the Coast Guard is on a path to failure without change. That kind of institutional candor is rare, and it's either the beginning of a real transformation or a warning that went unheeded. History will decide which. Hamilton built 10 boats to stop smugglers and accidentally created the foundation of an institution that would one day be running Arctic icebreaking operations and cyber commands. If that's not a case for taking the long view on institutional design, I don't know what is. Thanks for being here, and thanks to everyone listening to Copilot Podcasts. The next time you see a Coast Guard cutter, you'll know it's carrying 235 years of mission creep on its hull.
Thank you for joining us today on Voices of Life podcast. It's been an honor to share this moment of history with you. And now, as we continue producing more episodes with our partners, Michael and Emily, may every story strengthen your faith, deepen your understanding, and remind you that God is always at work in the world around us. Until next time, stay encouraged, stay grounded, and stay ready for what God has ahead.